Sisson. I'm originally from Long Island, New York, but I've been in Philly for 2 years now. I'm a sexuality educator. I also work in behavioral health, so I work with kids with autism. Yeah, it's a fun job. Get to work with a lot of awesome kids, but definitely find myself feeling exhausted all the time. And that's pretty much my personality, is just exhausted. Far from ordinary. I think the childhood I had is a little more common now. I grew up in a divorced family. My parents separated when I was 4 years old. It seems to be happening a lot more now, but at the time it was kind of rare. I think I had one friend at the time who also had, come from a divorced family. But I was lucky. My parents, lived not too far away, so about 10-minute drive. But my time was very split. I would go at my mom's from, Monday and Wednesday. My dad's would be Tuesday and Thursday, and every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday would switch. So I was all over the place. I kind of had to be organized, which is funny because now I'm the furthest thing from organized. But yeah, I had very loving and supportive parents, but not everything that shows on the outside is really what's going on the inside, especially as a child. The way we process things as kids is not the same as, if we were an adult. So I think during the time as a kid, I didn't think my childhood was that, unique or different from other kids. But as I grew up, I realized just how far from the truth that was. I had some other people move into my dad's house when I was about 6 years old. They're still a huge part of my life. Basically my other brothers and sisters and my stepmom. My mom's house was a little more quiet. It was just me and my sister that would go from my dad's to my mom's. But at my dad's, it would be the house of eight of us. So it's quite a lot of things going on there. So that was kind of where most of my trauma kind of happened, was just being the youngest in that house and certain things just not fully, coming to light until much later on in my life. Familial situation. So I have a biological sister, and then she's 4 years older than me. And then I have two other stepsisters who are also older than me. And then I have two stepbrothers who are older than me. And then there's a step half-sister in the mix who's 4 years younger than me, but she never lived with me, but she's still a big part of her family. So a lot of people, my biological sister is the one that I was always with. She would, the two of us were always on the same schedule, going to my mom's, going back to my dad's. And she's 4 years older than me. She's my protector. She was a lot of times like my mom away from my mom's house, which was helpful, but also put a big burden on her as well. Mostly growing up at my dad's house, there was, trauma within the house from someone who had come into the house. There was a lot of mental illness, and I think at the time that shadowed a lot of what was going on with respect to what that person had done to me. There was just a lot of violence and, physical and emotional and mental abuse. And there were, occasions of sexual abuse as well, as early as the age of 7. And, there was a time in particular that really, was a turning point for me in terms of my own experience with my sexuality. I was 7. I didn't really think much of the situation itself, but, the person in my household had exposed themselves to me and offered me money, to engage with them. And again, being 7, we're not in a point in our psychosexual development to fully understand what that means. But surprisingly enough, I just thought it was silly and weird. And so I was like, no, I'm not gonna do that. Why would I do that? But I thought it was a joke, and I carried that with me. I told a cousin that was younger than me about the scenario. Again, him not understanding what had just occurred, and he went and told his mom, and his mom had told my dad. And the last thing I really remember is being confronted by my dad about the situation. And I think, my dad being it being his own daughter that was potentially, victimized in some capacity, got very protective and angry. And so I think for me as a kid, I internalized his anger as like, oh no, I've just done something wrong. Even though nothing had really occurred, it was more just like I had just experienced something that I didn't fully understand, and now here's this angry reaction. I know it now that he was just angry that even at the offender that could have ever happened to me. But at the time I couldn't distinguish that, so I just kind of thought he was angry and at me. So it took me a while to realize like how that whole situation kind of unraveled, but it turns out that I ended up telling, when he confronted me and asked me about it, I told him it didn't happen. And so I grew up going on the rest of my life thinking that I had made it up. And so in middle school and high school, I would think about that situation all the time. I'd have flashbacks to it and just feel so uncomfortable and disgusted. And I thought there was something wrong with me because I was thinking about family members in a sexual context, thinking that it was just something that my brain was doing, that I was thinking about, that I was imagining, when in real life, it actually happened. It just was never, addressed appropriately. And there's just a lot of other, trauma that, went on to kind of reinforce those feelings. This person was very violent. We had to call the police multiple times for either threatening to kill people or, being a danger to himself. There's just a lot going on all the time. I used to stay up at night and wait until I would hear my dad and stepmom go to bed just to, be certain that I wouldn't wake up and find a dead body in the kitchen. It was just a lot to have to handle as a kid, and it kept me constantly being like hyper vigilant and a people pleaser. I was constantly reading everyone's feelings in the room to make sure that, this person wasn't on edge to the point that I could just step in or say something that's gonna, have him explode. Or, my dad was in a very miserable place because he didn't have a lot of control over these behaviors. And because of that, he was a lot of times, not feeling his best self. And a lot of times I just wanted him to be happy. So I was constantly trying to be, still super goofy. Even if I was upset, even if I had a rough day, I'd come home and if I saw that he was upset, I'd want to just try to make him feel better. So I'd push myself aside and just, be silly, even if I barely had any of that in me. But more than anything, I was constantly just making myself as small as possible, as inauthentic as possible, just so that I wouldn't trigger anybody else. A lot of times I feel like that contrast kind of caused this like dissonance, this cognitive dissonance of, this ability to be self-assuring, but never fully believe it. Because there was no consistency in how I felt about myself. I'd go from one place where I felt safe to another place where I didn't. And so, I felt lucky that I had that protective space to get away from things, but I also was constantly feeling guilty if I wanted to spend more time there. That I wasn't pleasing my dad and I wasn't making him happy, or I didn't really want to draw attention to the fact that I was scared to be in my own home in case that made things worse. Well, like I said, in middle school and high school, what was really difficult about, dealing with that trauma was just the flashback part of it and me telling myself that it wasn't real. So it caused this like aversion to anything relating to sexuality. I felt extremely anxious around pretty much all types of sexual behavior, talking about sexuality, talking about sex. It made me just feel physically unwell and uncomfortable because I thought I was just a perverted, like sick human being. It wasn't until I went to college, I started, consuming alcohol, that those things started to come out because I didn't have the ability to just, suppress them and not really think about it. So when I was drinking, I would just get to this point where I, would kind of just break down. Yeah, and it all these things would come out that my friends were trying to piece together. They're like, this doesn't really make sense what you're saying. And I would just be asking for my sister. And it was one of my brother's weddings when me and two of my sisters had been talking about, just things that had gone on in the family. And it finally just came out that I said, what had happened to me, and they had validated it in a way that finally made it felt real to me. And that kind of triggered this cascading effect of, kind of going downhill until I find a point where I'm like, I need to get help. And that point didn't come too far after that. It was about a month or two after that I just had an influx of feelings, and it was very overwhelming going from, I made this up, to, oh my God, I didn't.
Well, 14 years of all of that trauma that was just kind of unleashed, and within 2 months, I got to a point where I just was starting to not want to be here anymore. And I was never that kind of kid. And so I think that was really alarming for me, because I was never like that, because I had masked my trauma so well for so long by just, telling myself it wasn't real. So having someone tell me that, no, I think you're right, it did happen, was just like very overwhelming. I'm very proactive about my mental health. It's something that I know can burden other people so deeply, and that's just a part of my people-pleasing tendencies. I don't want to put my own stuff on other people. And I think once those feelings started to come out of those suicidal ideations, it was like, this is too big and this is gonna hurt too many people. I need to get a hold of this. So I immediately started going to therapy at that point, which it took a long time to get to the place I'm at now, but I'm here, I'm talking about it openly. It's the first time I'm talking about it this openly. I haven't really named a lot of the behaviors around what exactly happened in that scenario, just because a big part of, in my therapy that I had to work on was just validating the act itself, that because it wasn't, something worse. It wasn't, I wasn't touched or, I wasn't, penetrated by force. There wasn't violence in that exact moment, but it was, the unawareness of the context paired with this, anger around the situation that I had just done something wrong. And then as I grew up, just learning about sexual acts and constantly picturing those things, it was all these different pieces that had to kind of fit together to make this situation as traumatic as it was for me. It had impacted my sexuality so much to the point where I went from, being extremely sexually averse to almost using my sexuality to validate myself as a person. That's kind of where I went more in college. So now my profession is that I got my master's degree in sexuality. It's kind of weird how I got there. I actually went to college for integrative neuroscience, and I was going to apply to med school, and it was just not feeling right. And I was in a developmental psychology class, and I was learning about, sexuality, but I was specifically learning about gender development at the time. And I just found the topic to be extremely interesting. Just hearing different perspectives of gender and how people feel within their own body. And at the same time, I had a cousin come out as trans. So this is kind of what ignited my passion for the sexuality field, because it actually caused a lot of relationships to dissipate within that side of the family. So I'm extremely close with my cousin. He's my best friend, but I don't speak to majority of the family surrounding that situation, just because of how volatile the situation became. And I just feel so strongly about him and his identity and my love for him that I had no problem just, burning bridges that needed to be burned, because they were invalidating an identity and going as far as, acts of violence, outing him publicly and putting his dead name out into the, media, and pictures of him into media. It's really horrible, the things that had been done to him. And so I started to do a lot of research around, gender identity, trans identities, intersex identities, just initially to become a better ally. But then the topic just became more of a passion. And I think through research, researching those topics, and because they were so relevant to situations that, I was experiencing within my family, I started to realize just how comforting research and education can be around, certain types of experiences. So I actually started to do a lot of research around childhood sexual trauma and psychosexual development. And through all that research, I found a lot of things that helped me cope with my own experience, just being like, wow, there's a lot of things that, a lot of behaviors I, showed, or a lot of feelings that I had that are just supported by so many other, victims of childhood trauma. It was really validating to see how many people have had similar experiences or have felt the same things. And it really helped in my ability to kind of cope with that. So just education became extremely empowering, and that research component felt like really empowering as well. So that's the direction I decided to start to look in, was how can I do sexuality research? And then I started looking into sexuality-based grad programs, and I found Widener, and that's where I went. I just finished up in August. It was hard having to do that while simultaneously, working in the applied behavior analysis field. It's not a typical job to have to work while being in a full-time grad program, having to go into work and getting punched and kicked and bit and spit on. But yeah, it's a physically draining job, but I had to say it's like the most rewarding job I've ever had. I can see how much I actually make a difference, and what's even cooler is that I have such a strong passion for the sexuality field. But once I started, I kind of just fell into the behavior world by chance. And I realized just how much I love that field and how much the intersection of the two is needed. There's so many, children with intellectual and developmental disabilities that have sexual behaviors or sexuality needs that just go overlooked, because a lot of times people are assuming that they don't have any sort of like sexual identity, or they don't have sexuality needs because, some may be, non-speaking and can't really express to you their needs. Others may not really understand, certain behaviors that are appropriate versus inappropriate because their accessibility to sex ed is a lot more restrictive. So there's such a strong need for work with, kids with IDDs with respect to sexuality and sexual behaviors and sexual trauma. I mean, it's a population that often sees a lot of sexual trauma as well. And I just feel like that's kind of become my purpose just by chance. And I have multiple encyclopedias and dictionaries of all these different types of sexual identities and sexual behaviors, orientations. Sexuality is a spectrum. There's so many different components to it, and it's actually something the terminology itself is something I've personally struggled with. My first semester in my grad program, we had to do this activity where we basically named and labeled each part of our identity: our religion, our socioeconomic status, our race, our sexual orientation. And out of all of them, that was the one that I was like, ugh. I didn't feel like I had enough language to encompass like all the things that I feel. I didn't fully feel straight, but I also didn't feel right taking up queer space. But that was also just an issue with me feeling like I don't deserve to take up any space at all. Trauma things. So how those things just really play into every aspect of, our identity is unreal. But it took a lot of, education around different types of sexual orientations and different ways that, behavior and feelings and attractions kind of intertwine to create one identity or multiple identities. Some people can feel romantically inclined towards certain genders, but sexually inclined towards something different. And I think for me, my issue was that I didn't really have a preference for anything. And it was something that I didn't feel like was valid because I had only had certain types of, interactions. And most of my experiences had been heterosexual at that point, even though I felt like internally, there's so much more to me than that. But again, I grew up feeling like I had to be small to stay safe. And that carried with me my entire life. I had to be small. And a queer identity felt really big to me, and sometimes it still does. But I actually came out this past year as pansexual. I'm in my first queer relationship. I have an amazing girlfriend, and it's by far the healthiest relationship I've ever had. And I think a big piece of it is that I don't really feel that trauma piece coming up. I feel safe and I feel secure. And it's also the first time I'm like trusting myself and my own instincts. And I think especially for me, when I'm dating men, a lot of those things, those trauma pieces come up because I tend to play small, and I tend to, read into that person's feelings and making sure that I'm in accordance with their feelings so that I'm keeping myself safe. And I know that that's not everyone's experience. And I know that's not to say that all men are bad. It's just how my experience growing up with certain men kind of shaped my sexual experiences with them. I'm the reason also why I've come to be able to speak about it openly is because I want to do that. I want to use, that's something that's helping me cope, is being able to use the story. I'm a big proponent of like the cascade effect of vulnerability. If I can stand here and talk about my experience and do it without crying, good job. I can stand up here and be vulnerable and speak about that. And I'm hoping that maybe it will help someone else realize that you have to center yourself. If you're the victim, center yourself. And I think that's what's hard, is taking up that space and centering yourself, because it's uncomfortable for the victim themselves. They want to hide behind it. But I think a big piece of it too is when you have that people pleaser component, you're not even focused on how it's making you feel. You're focused on like, okay, well, if I talk about this, how's it making other people feel? And that was a big thing about me talking about this today, was I've had to have a few conversations. I still am going to have a few conversations with, some family members that I'm doing this, and I'm not having this conversation with you to ask for permission. I'm having this conversation with you because you're someone I care about, and I don't want you to be blindsided when I speak about this, because I know it involves you and I know it makes you uncomfortable, but this is my story. This is my trauma. I'm allowed to own it and do what I want with it. And for me, I think it's more empowering to use it in a way that actually helps other people. Sometimes to a detriment. I am very intellectual about, my feelings, but that's also been how I understand them and cope with them. I mean, I have to sit there and pinpoint, why I feel a certain way or why I behave a certain way, in order for me to like accept it, or just to make space for it. Because growing up in a way that I was just constantly worried about being safe, my biggest priority was just not really, don't trust yourself. Trust like how people are giving you feedback. Trust the interaction, not yourself. So as long as people were presenting happy and positive ways, and I knew I was doing something right, and those behaviors were just constantly reinforced. So I was raised Lutheran, and I have to say my own personal experience with religion was extremely positive. My mom was Lutheran, and it was just, that was just something she felt strongly about, was she wanted to raise her kids as Lutheran as well. The church I grew up in they had a really huge music program. I'm a big music person. So it was it was a good environment. I'm still friends with all my friends from church. I was surprisingly very involved in church. That being said, it was never something that was a comfort for me, especially because so many things had happened and I had so many strong feelings about my own life and myself. And I just had always, I think growing up, had wanted to pray or be like, give me something different, or like and I just never got the satisfaction that I wanted, or the comfort or the serenity, whatever was supposed to come with it. And I started questioning that piece of myself in college. So I now would say I identify as agnostic. I'm not going to say what there is or isn't. It's not comforting for me, but I can understand why it is for other people. On the other side of that, I have other people in my life that, use religion in an extremely toxic and negative way, which has tainted most of my experience with religion as a whole. And I have a hard time, viewing certain religion in certain contexts and how it's used, especially, in the United States, especially with certain, sexuality policy. It's something that I think needs to be kept personal and sacred, rather than influencing every other, structure that's in place for other people that might not believe the same thing. And I think that's the piece that I tend to struggle with, especially when it comes from people that are really close to me. But I have no room for any religion or God that is going to condemn someone else's identity. Not so much as like with my clients, because a lot of them, most of that situation isn't related to religion, more so to their like a level of ability. I think that's what I experience more in the field is, the misconceptions that, people who aren't, who don't speak the same as other, don't communicate the same, don't behave the same, don't have, sexual feelings or sexual identities. That's what I've experienced more so in the field than anything. But I have experienced that a lot within the professional field, the professional world of sexuality, where I have encountered a lot of people who actually work right at that intersection of sexuality and religion, trying to, mend that gap that, religion has placed on this, like the sexual minority communities. But I also know a lot of people that have had that harm happen, where religion was used in a way that they felt like they weren't able to be their authentic selves. My biggest thing at this point is, how sex educators are going to make their way in the world, and how they can constantly be, doing works of activism and works of anti-racism and, combating ableism, all these different things within the classroom. And I think that a lot of that stems down to just constantly acknowledging that every educator is a student for life. You have to constantly be educating yourself, be staying up to date. As we said, there's so many different, ways to describe one's sexual identity. There's so many different terms, and they're constantly evolving because the way in which people explore their identity and explain their identity is expanding. So I think more than anything is just constantly staying up to date with what's going on, and more than anything, just leaving space to be, to have feedback, because I think that can cause people to feel a little stuck is when they're in that expert mode that I know what I'm talking about. I've done this for forever. Well, let's go back to our journals and our articles, and let's see like what's been going on recently. Like, let's see what people are having to say about the way that, we've been educating each other. I think feedback is one of the best things that educators can have, and just constantly wanting to learn more. My advice to anyone would be to just take up the space that you deserve. It's okay to set boundaries and to, cut people off that don't make you feel like your best self. If you feel like you're constantly having to mask who you are, or pretend that you are something you're not, if you feel like you have to put on a show to make someone else feel comfortable around you, then it's time to, question why we're doing that. You'll never really be happy if you're not being who you want to be. And a big part of being authentic is who you're surrounding yourself by. I think that's it. Just take up your space. It's okay. And surround that space of the people that, make you feel like you.